In northern Nigeria, religion and politics often sit side by side. Sometimes they cooperate, sometimes they collide, and sometimes they produce a story that forces the entire country to stop and ask difficult questions about justice, identity, and power. One of those stories belongs to a quiet farmer from Adamawa State, a man named Sunday Jackson. For more than a decade, Jackson lived inside the walls of a Nigerian prison, not because he planned a crime, not because he went looking for violence, but because he survived one. In 2015, a violent confrontation on a farm ended with one man dead and another man accused of murder. Jackson said he fought for his life. The court said he should have run away. And in 2021, the judgment came down: death by hanging. The case quickly grew beyond a simple criminal trial. Across Nigeria, it became a conversation about self-defense, ethnic tensions, religious identity, and the complicated relationship between law and justice in the country's northern states. Then, on Christmas Eve in 2025, the story took a dramatic turn. One signature from Ahmadu Umaru Fintiri changed everything. A pardon. A prison door opened, and a man who once waited for execution walked out into freedom. But even after the pardon, the questions refused to disappear. Did the Nigerian justice system fail him, or did the courts simply follow the law as they understood it? To understand why the case of Sunday Jackson stirred such deep emotions across Nigeria, it is necessary to return to where the story began: a quiet farm, a sudden attack, and a decision made in seconds that would shape the next 11 years of one man's life. This is Naija Update 24/7, a place where the stories behind Nigeria's headlines are examined carefully and thoughtfully. Across the country, political decisions often carry deep social consequences. Religious identity, ethnic diversity, and regional power dynamics all shape how laws are interpreted and how justice is delivered. The Sunday Jackson case sits right at the center of that complex national conversation. Understanding it requires patience, context, and a closer look at the events that unfolded over more than a decade. In 2015, life in rural Adamawa State followed a rhythm familiar to many farming communities across northern Nigeria. Farmers woke early, fields were tended, livestock grazed nearby. But beneath that quiet routine, tensions between farmers and herders had been slowly building for years. Competition over land and grazing routes often created conflicts. Sometimes the disagreements ended peacefully, sometimes they did not. On one particular day in 2015, Sunday Jackson walked onto his farm expecting another ordinary morning of work. Instead, according to court records and testimonies presented later in court, an argument broke out between Jackson and a Fulani herdsman whose cattle had entered the farmland. What happened next unfolded quickly. Reports say the confrontation escalated. The herdsman allegedly attacked Jackson with a knife. A struggle followed. In that struggle, Jackson managed to wrestle control of the weapon. Moments later, the attacker lay fatally wounded. The violence had ended, but the legal battle was only beginning. Jackson was arrested soon after. To him, the situation was clear. He believed he had defended himself against a deadly attack. But inside Nigeria's legal system, the interpretation of those moments would become the central issue, and the outcome would change the direction of his life. After his arrest, Jackson entered a legal process that would stretch across several years. The case eventually moved through the courts in Adamawa State. By 2021, the trial had reached its conclusion. The court examined witness accounts, forensic evidence, and the arguments from both prosecution and defense. Jackson's lawyers argued that he acted in self-defense. They maintained that the farmer had faced an immediate threat to his life and had reacted in the only way available to him. But the court reached a different conclusion. The judge ruled that Jackson had used excessive force after gaining control of the weapon. According to the court's reasoning, once the knife had been taken from the attacker, the immediate danger had passed. The law, the court said, required restraint. And so the verdict was delivered: murder.
The sentence followed quickly: death by hanging. For Jackson's family, the moment was devastating. For Jackson himself, the future suddenly narrowed to a prison cell and the possibility of execution. Years passed inside Nigeria's correctional system. While the outside world continued moving forward, Jackson remained inside prison walls, waiting, hoping that the appeals process might offer another chance. Legal appeals moved slowly through Nigeria's judicial system. Eventually, the case reached the country's highest court, the Supreme Court of Nigeria. By the time the case arrived there, the story had already drawn attention from activists and legal observers. Many people believed the court might reconsider the issue of self-defense. Supporters argued that Jackson had faced a life-threatening situation. They believed the courts should recognize the realities of rural violence and personal survival. But when the Supreme Court delivered its judgment in March 2025, the decision surprised many observers. The justices upheld the lower court's ruling. Their reasoning focused on one specific point. They argued that after Jackson had disarmed the attacker, he had the opportunity to escape rather than retaliate. In their interpretation of the law, that moment changed the legal equation. Once the threat could be avoided, lethal force was no longer justified. The ruling meant the death sentence would stand. For Jackson, the legal road had reached its final stop. There were no higher courts left to appeal to. The execution order now remained a possibility, and the case began to attract wider public attention. As news of the Supreme Court ruling spread, reactions began emerging across Nigeria and beyond. Human rights advocates raised concerns about the interpretation of self-defense laws. To them, the decision created troubling questions about how ordinary citizens could legally protect themselves during violent confrontations. Organizations like Amnesty International began speaking publicly about the case. Another group, Advocacy for Prisoners' Children, also joined the campaign for clemency. Activists organized petitions and awareness campaigns. Church groups and community leaders also began discussing the case. Within months, a petition calling for mercy gathered more than 70,000 signatures. For many Nigerians, the story symbolized something larger than a single legal dispute. It touched on long-standing tensions between farming communities and herders. It also intersected with the country's religious diversity. Jackson was a Christian farmer in a region where religious and ethnic identities often shape public debate. As discussions intensified, the case gradually transformed into a national conversation. But the final decision would not come from a courtroom. It would come from a political office.
By late 2025, the pressure surrounding the case had grown significant. Public conversations continued. Advocacy groups maintained their campaigns, and attention slowly turned toward the office of the governor. Under Nigeria's constitutional system, state governors possess the power to grant clemency in certain cases. That authority allows them to pardon prisoners or reduce sentences when they believe justice or compassion requires it. In Adamawa State, that responsibility belonged to Amadu Umaru Fintiri. As Christmas approached in December 2025, the governor announced a list of prisoners receiving clemency. Among the names was Sunday Jackson. On December 24, the governor signed the official pardon order. After 11 years inside prison, Jackson's sentence was cancelled, the death penalty disappeared, and the prison gates opened. For Jackson, the moment marked the end of a long and uncertain chapter. For the country, it marked the beginning of another debate. Legal confirmation of the pardon soon followed. Jackson's legal representative, Emmanuel Ogebe, announced that the governor's decision had granted a full pardon. That meant Jackson's civil rights were restored. The conviction no longer carried legal consequences. After more than a decade behind bars, he was free to begin rebuilding his life. But freedom after such a long imprisonment carries its own challenges. The world outside had changed. Communities had moved forward. Technology, politics, and society had evolved. For Jackson, reintegration would require patience and support. Still,
Supporters saw the moment as a rare victory. A case that once seemed destined to end in execution had concluded with a second chance. Yet, the deeper questions raised by the case remain part of Nigeria's national conversation. What does self-defense truly mean under Nigerian law? How should courts interpret violent confrontations that unfold in seconds? And how should justice systems balance strict legal interpretation with the realities of human survival? The Sunday Jackson case forced many Nigerians to think about those questions. For some, the courts simply applied the law as written. For others, the outcome revealed gaps in how that law addresses real-world violence. Either way, the case demonstrated the complex intersection of law, politics, religion, and identity within Nigeria's diverse society. From a farm confrontation in 2015 to a death sentence in 2021 to a final pardon on Christmas Eve in 2025, the journey of Sunday Jackson stretches across more than a decade of Nigerian legal and political history. It is a story about survival, a story about law, and a story about the difficult choices societies face when justice, politics, and human lives intersect. Long after the prison gates opened, the debate surrounding the case continues. Because in Nigeria, a country of many cultures, many faiths, and many perspectives, the search for justice is rarely simple, and sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that leave a nation still asking questions. For months after the ruling of the Supreme Court of Nigeria, the fate of Sunday Jackson appeared sealed. Inside prison walls, time moved slowly. Execution dates in Nigeria are rarely announced publicly in advance. Prisoners on death row often live in a state of prolonged uncertainty, waiting for a knock on the door that may or may not come. Jackson's case had already traveled through every level of the judicial system. The courts had spoken. Legally, the matter was finished. But outside the courtroom, another kind of pressure was building. Religious leaders began discussing the case during sermons. Civil rights groups wrote reports examining the interpretation of self-defense laws. Lawyers debated the precedent the ruling might create for future cases. Across Nigeria's diverse religious landscape, the story touched sensitive ground. Sunday Jackson was a Christian farmer. The man he killed was a Fulani herdsman. In many parts of northern Nigeria, farmer-herder conflicts had already become symbols of deeper anxieties about land, identity, and survival. Some people saw the case purely as a legal issue. Others saw something larger, a reflection of long-standing tensions between communities struggling over land, security, and recognition. Within this growing national conversation, attention gradually shifted toward the office of Amadu Umaru Fintiri. Under Nigeria's constitution, governors possess the power to grant clemency to prisoners convicted under state law. It is a rare and serious authority. A governor may choose to exercise that power when legal justice and public conscience appear to diverge. For months, no one knew whether that authority would be used in Jackson's case. Then December arrived. In Nigeria, the final weeks of the year carry deep emotional meaning. Christmas is not only a religious celebration for many Christians, it is also a time when political leaders sometimes announce acts of mercy, pardons meant to symbolize reconciliation and compassion. On December 24, 2025, an announcement emerged from the Adamawa State Government House. Governor Amadu Umaru Fintiri had signed a Christmas clemency order. The document listed several prisoners whose sentences would be reduced or forgiven. Among the names was Sunday Jackson. For a moment, many Nigerians struggled to believe what they were hearing. Inside the prison, officials confirmed the order. Jackson's death sentence had been cancelled. His conviction would no longer carry legal punishment. The prison gates opened. After 11 years behind bars, the man who once waited for execution walked out as a free citizen. But the pardon did not silence the questions surrounding his case. In many ways, it made those questions even louder. When the pardon order became public, legal observers immediately began examining its implications. According to Jackson's legal counsel, Emmanuel Ogibi, the governor's decision carried several important consequences. First, it permanently stopped the execution order. Second, it restored Jackson's civil rights, allowing him to live again as a free member of society without the restrictions placed on convicted prisoners. Third, it closed one of the most controversial legal battles in recent Nigerian history. For Jackson's supporters, the pardon represented the correction of a painful injustice. They believed the legal system had failed to recognize the realities of violent self-defense. For them, the governor's intervention restored moral balance. But not everyone saw the situation the same way. Some legal analysts argued that the courts simply applied the law as written. From their perspective, the issue was not injustice but legal interpretation. The judges had concluded that Jackson used lethal force at a moment when escape might have been possible. In their reading of the law, that distinction mattered. The governor's pardon, they said, did not overturn the legal reasoning of the courts. Instead, it acknowledged the broader human circumstances surrounding the case. In other words, two ideas could exist at the same time. Legally, the conviction remained a product of the court's interpretation. Politically and morally, the governor chose compassion, and that decision opened a deeper national debate.
To understand why the Sunday Jackson case resonated so widely, it is necessary to examine the wider landscape of northern Nigeria. The region is home to a complex blend of religious traditions, ethnic identities, and legal systems. Several northern states operate under a dual legal structure. Civil courts function alongside Islamic legal institutions, often associated with Sharia. Although Jackson's case moved through the conventional criminal courts, public discussion often connected it to the broader politics of religion and governance in the north. For decades, debates about Sharia law have shaped Nigerian political discourse. Supporters argue that Islamic legal systems provide moral guidance and cultural continuity for Muslim communities. Critics worry that overlapping legal systems may create tensions within Nigeria's multi-religious society. The Jackson case unexpectedly entered that debate. Some commentators framed the issue as part of the broader conversation about how different communities experience justice in Nigeria. Others warned against turning a criminal case into a religious controversy. Still, the underlying anxieties were difficult to ignore. Farmer-herder conflicts had already created painful memories in many rural communities. Entire villages had been displaced by violence in parts of northern and central Nigeria. Families on both sides of those conflicts carried deep fears about safety, land, and survival. In that environment, Jackson's story became more than a legal file. It became a mirror reflecting the insecurities of a nation trying to balance tradition, diversity, and modern law. While political debates filled television studios and newspaper columns, another reality unfolded quietly in Jackson's personal life. 11 years is a long time. It is long enough for children to grow into teenagers, long enough for parents to age, long enough for entire communities to change. During those years, Jackson's life unfolded inside the routines of prison. Days structured by guards, schedules, and limited freedom. In many Nigerian prisons, life moves slowly. Prisoners develop small survival routines: prayer, conversation, reflection. Hope becomes fragile. For someone living under a death sentence, every year carries an additional psychological weight. The knowledge that life might end through a state execution hangs silently in the background. Jackson's supporters often described him as a man sustained by faith. But even strong faith cannot erase the emotional toll of prolonged uncertainty. By the time the pardon arrived, he had spent more than a decade removed from ordinary life. Re-entering society would require rebuilding everything. The Jackson case also revived an older legal conversation within Nigeria. What exactly constitutes self-defense? The law recognizes the right of individuals to protect themselves from immediate danger, but courts must determine where defensive action ends and excessive force begins. In peaceful environments, that distinction may seem clear. In violent confrontations lasting only seconds, it becomes far more complicated. Legal scholars across Nigeria began revisiting earlier cases involving similar questions. Some argued that courts should consider the psychological stress experienced during sudden attacks. Others emphasized the need to maintain strict limits on lethal force. The debate reflected a larger tension within criminal law. On one side lies the principle of restraint, on the other lies the instinct for survival. Jackson's case sat directly between those two principles, and the governor's pardon ensured the conversation would not disappear. Nigeria is a country built on diversity. More than 200 million people, hundreds of ethnic groups, multiple religious traditions, and a political system constantly negotiating those differences. In such a complex society, legal decisions often carry symbolic meaning beyond the courtroom. The Jackson case revealed how quickly a single legal verdict can become part of a wider national story. A story about security in rural communities, a story about the role of religion in public life, a story about how justice systems respond when law and lived reality collide. For many Nigerians, the pardon represented a moment of relief. For others, it remained a reminder of how fragile trust in institutions can become when communities feel misunderstood. Yet, the case also demonstrated something important. Despite fierce debate, Nigeria's democratic structures continued functioning. Courts delivered judgments, advocates organized petitions, political leaders exercised constitutional powers. The system, imperfect as it may be, continued moving. Freedom does not erase the past. When Jackson stepped outside prison walls, he entered a world that had changed dramatically during his absence. Technology had advanced, political leadership had shifted, entire conversations within Nigerian society had evolved. For someone returning after 11 years, even simple routines required adjustment. Finding work, rebuilding relationships, learning again how to move through ordinary daily life. Supporters hoped the national attention surrounding his case might help create opportunities for a new beginning. But they also understood that reintegration would take time. In many ways, Jackson now carried a unique identity. To some, he was a survivor of a flawed legal process. To others, he remained a controversial figure connected to a tragic death. Living with those conflicting perceptions would become part of his future. Even after the pardon, several questions continue echoing across Nigeria. Should the legal definition of self-defense be clarified? How should courts evaluate violent encounters that unfold in seconds? And how can justice systems remain sensitive to the cultural and social realities of rural life? These questions extend far beyond the story of one man. They touch the daily experiences of farmers, herders, traders, and ordinary citizens navigating complex environments. In that sense, the Jackson case represents something larger than its legal record. It represents a moment when a nation paused to examine how justice works and how it might work better. From a confrontation on a quiet farm in 2015, to a death sentence delivered years later, to a Christmas Eve pardon that captured the attention of the entire country, the journey of Sunday Jackson traces a path through some of the most sensitive issues in Nigerian society: law, religion, identity, security, and the search for fairness in a complicated world. For Jackson, the road eventually led out of prison, but for Nigeria, the deeper conversation continues. Because stories like this do not end when the prison gates open. They continue in courtrooms, in communities, and in the national conscience. And they remind the country that justice is not only about laws written in books, it is also about how those laws touch real human lives.